Everybody out for class this morning. Good number present for study. Glad you're here. We've got two new sheets coming out today. One will be the text with the note page attached to it, and then the other is the discussion questions for chapter 4, Daniel chapter 4. And if you're reading ahead, Daniel 4 is a very interesting chapter to me. I hope you'll take some time and really study through Daniel chapter 4. And there's another dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream. Daniel interprets that. And then something happens to Nebuchadnezzar at the end of chapter 4. And that to me is a very fascinating end of a chapter. And some of the things that happen to Nebuchadnezzar, I hope you'll give some thought to that. I'd love to hear your think so when we discuss it next week. Today we are in chapter 3. So if you need the notes for chapter 3 and didn't get them last week, there are extra copies on that shelving unit on the back wall, but we're in Daniel chapter 3. We're looking forward to an exciting study about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego today. So again, you're getting two sheets. One will be the text with the note page, and then you'll have a separate sheet of discussion questions just for chapter 4. And if you will, take those home, do some research, think through the questions, jot down your think so, and I think that adds to class. I really appreciate when there's good discussion. I think it makes class really, really good. When you've studied and I've studied, we've all studied, and I think we put our heads together, and between us all, we can figure out what's going on in the text.
David, did you by any chance take those cubes and figure out how big this thing was that we made?
It's big. Yes, huge. I want to say real quick, I know we've been praying for Freeman for a long time, and I know over the last couple of days, a good number of people have gone out to visit Freeman. If you have a plan to go do that, if you're thinking we need to get out and do that, you need to go now and do that. He's not doing very good at all. So if you have a future plan jotted down in your notes somewhere that you want to go out and see Debbie and Freeman, I would say in the next day or two you probably need to go out and visit Freeman and Debbie. They would love the encouragement, but he's not doing well. He's declining very rapidly. So if you have a plan to go out and see him, I would encourage you to go do that very quickly. All right, Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. We try in our class to follow the discussion questions, and that's what we'll do this class. And we do this because we have a specific aim. Obviously, we're looking for something specific within the text, but it also, we usually, one question might cover several verses, and it gives us a chance to go through and discuss several of the details within that section. And the first one is going to do that for us in verses 1 through 7. Okay? Thank you, Dad. Appreciate it. Thanks, Don. Appreciate you helping out. All right. So here's the first question. This gets us through the first 7 verses of chapter 3. First question, Nebuchadnezzar establishes penalty for those who refuse to worship the image. We're going to talk about that image in just a second. That's in the first 7 verses. We can see a lot of other examples of this throughout history, right? Where somebody requires something of God's children and then imposes a penalty if they don't do what they're being asked to do. And then we're going to ask in just a minute, can you see some parallels in Daniel 3 to our culture today? Do you see some parallels to that? And do you see a time coming when there will be increased punishments for those who do not fall down and worship the idols of the king, so to speak? And that's today. And also, can idols be more than a graven image? So we have a lot going on, but there's a really good sort of a parallel, perhaps, to some things we see today. So let me just open it up about your general thoughts about the first 7 verses here, and we'll go back and note a couple of things. What did you find out about the first 7 verses, about the king and what he's requiring of them? Let's do this. Let's begin in verse 1. Joel was just talking about the image itself. Let's take a look at verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width was 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Did anybody do any calculating on the cubit there and what that might equal? Joel and then Terry? Go ahead, Joel.
90 feet.
Yeah. Is that what you got, Terry? Yeah. Depending on how you measure a cubit, because there's a lot of...
18 or 20 inch. I did the 18.
Yeah, and I think the standard is if you take the 18-inch, which most people think is the standard, you have an image, and you can imagine this in your mind's eye, right? You look across a plain, the plain of Dura, and you see a 90-foot tall image that's about 9 foot wide. It's a huge object that's standing out in the middle of the plain. And it could be, depending on how a culture would date or a measure a cubit, it could be even taller than that. It might exceed 100 feet, but you're talking at least 90 feet by 9 feet. It's huge. Now, there's a huge debate on what that image was, whether the image was in the shape of a person or a thing, and it's debated. We don't really know for sure. I don't even know if you have any thoughts on that or if you gave any thought to it. It wouldn't matter either way. It's likely that it was in the shape of something that we would be familiar with because it was representative of something else. But it likely could have just been like an obelisk, out there, just some sort of a big slender column that was out with perhaps writing or something on it, etchings on it. It could have been something like that. But it also could have been something like the figure of a being. As a matter of fact, looking at this, it's interesting because he made an image of gold. Now, we talked about gold, but what has he just had happen?
It's a dream.
He just had a dream.
He was the head of
And he was the head of gold. Do you think perhaps that there's a connection between this huge image made of gold and he's just had a dream about an image and he was the head of gold? Do you think perhaps maybe now he's flaunting a little bit? That gold might represent me because I've just been told I'm the head of gold in this big, huge dream. I don't know, but it's interesting if that dream and the interpretation of it influenced the creation of this huge image at the beginning of chapter 3 and verse 1. The plain of Dura was about 12 miles to the southeast of Babylon, so it was just outside the city a bit. They were expanding. They were always building. And in verses 2 and 3, it's interesting, in verses 2 and 3, you have what essentially we would call a grand opening of this because, if someone in town is going to open up a new business downtown, right? They've got a brand new building they've built that's going to be a commercial building and all these law offices are going to be put in. They're going to break the ground on it. Who normally gets invited to stuff like that? Yeah, you get the celebrities to come in and do that because it draws attention to the building. And he does exactly the same thing. In verse 2, he gathers the satraps, and those are like kingdom guardians. The satraps, we'll see that throughout the book. Administrators, governors, counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And generally what happens is, if you bring in celebrities, what's that do for the general populace? It brings them in too, right? If someone says, hey, we're dedicating a new building downtown, and they're bringing in X actor or actress from Hollywood, people will show up just to see the actor or the actress from Hollywood. And so if you got all these celebrities in Babylon, these are high-profile people, the idea would be you bring lots of other folks in too. So you've got these people, but you may have thousands of people in addition to that who have been brought in to do this. And also it was a custom in that day to build images like this, because through these images they paid deity to the so-called gods that had given them victory over whatever. And so Babylon was a huge steamroller just sort of taking over the world. And so it's probably a regular practice that they had these images that represented the gods that had given them victory. And Babylon was a very polytheistic society, so they had many deities in their society. So in this instance, it's not that he's imposing a singular religion or a singular god on the people. He's just trying to honor what they perceive as one of the gods who has given them victory over something. And when I read this, I'm not sure that he goes into this with the primary purpose of religious persecution. I'm not sure that that's his main goal in this, but it is a byproduct of what's going on. So he puts a condition on it in verse 4. The herald cried aloud, "To you it's commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time that you hear the sound of basically a conglomeration of musical instruments, horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you'll fall down, you'll worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now here's a question, and I don't know that I can answer this. What about this burning fiery furnace? Is this something that you think he created specifically, specially for this occasion? Or do you think that there might have already been a furnace out there somewhere? What's your thought on that?
Probably already there.
I think.
It mentions the fact of the temperature of the furnace being greater than
Yeah.
it was before. So
Yeah, it might indicate that it was already there. If they're building cities, what kind of furnace might have been out there already?
Brick furnace.
Yeah, some sort of a kiln or a brick oven out there, the baking of bricks to get them strong and used for support. So it's likely it was already, he's just using some sort of facility that's already there, probably some sort of a kiln. And it's interesting in verse 6, he makes this decree and he goes, it'll be cast immediately into it. So it sounds like it's already a pre-existing kiln. But the refusal of the king's order was considered a treasonous act on this occasion. Yes, Philip?
And one of the commentaries read said that they had huge ovens to make brick back then. It would
Yeah.
be real huge ones.
They would have to have that. Yeah.
And they were well all over the city. Where they,
Yeah, this is. It would be one thing if you were building you had some sort of a kiln to build a patio, and all you needed to make were a few hundred brick. But when you're building cities, you need huge pits of fire to do that. And so it's likely that there was something. Obviously, it had to be big enough for these men to be thrown into. It had to be huge in some way, and it was extremely, extremely hot, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So the first section, verses 1 through 7, not a terribly difficult thing to understand. He builds a huge image, whatever that was, and it was pagan oriented. It was in honor of some deity, some god, and of course, in some way, Nebuchadnezzar probably perceived himself to be a god in some way, and he issues a command. When you hear the music, you bow down and you do what I tell you to do, or you're going to be punished for that. Okay? Now, let's modernize that a little bit. Do you see any parallels in what's taking place here and what might be happening in the world today? Do you see some parallels? And if so, what would be the parallel to that? What, Joel?
I think first of all, I had to go down to the last question first. Can idols be more than graven images?
Yeah.
When I established, yes, they can, then you can just look at all kinds of things,
Yeah, so I think Joel's got a good point. Let's do that last question first. Can an idol be more than just a graven image? Does it have to be something carved out of wood or stone or iron? Can it be anything?
Yes.
Okay. Here's an example of this. Go to Colossians chapter 3. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3. So you're going to want to hold your place back in Daniel chapter 3. But let's move up to the book of Colossians. Very familiar passage, right? He starts out by talking about putting our affection on things above, where Christ sits at the right hand of the throne of God. Drop down to verse 5. So this is a consequence of having been converted. Therefore, put to death your members which are on earth. There are a lot of fleshly things that we can't have those anymore if we're Christians. But notice his description: fornication, okay, we would get that. Uncleanness, yeah, passion, evil desire. And then he says, and covetousness, comma. And what does he call covetousness? Idolatry. It's idolatry. What is idolatry? What's an idol? Okay, that's it. Angie had the right definition there, which is an idol is anything that we give our priority to. It's anything that assumes our attention over God. Okay? So money is not inherently wrong, but could money become an idol if it takes a place over God? Yes. Sure. And a television is not necessarily an idol, but it can be if it becomes the primary source of our devotion, right? And so anything can become an idol. Do you think that for example, just in America, because we live in an American context, do you think that America has a bunch of idols today? We live in a world of idolatry. And I think to Joel's point, some of those idols, we're now seeing there's a lot of pressure to either accept those or get the consequence of not doing that. And so I think there's a lot of pressure. Either you fall lockstep behind the idolatry, or there's going to be some consequences if you don't do that. Now, what might some of those be today?
I think sports teams.
What is it?
Sports teams.
Okay, yeah. Sports. Somebody over here had something?
I was just going to say, for people that work, a lot of times you got to work the overtime or you
Yeah.
get looked down upon. And
Yeah.
that means sometimes missing church, working on Sundays, working Wednesday nights. I mean, and it becomes to the point that you don't ever get to go to worship.
Yeah, I think so. So a job can be that way, and sometimes the demands of an employer can be like that as well.
Or you may lose it. You may lose
Yeah, I mean that's the threat of losing that. Doris?
I think a lot of times it's not our own wants that we want to do.
Oh, sure.
And we use that as an excuse.
Yeah, sometimes we do that. What about culturally? Do you think we're seeing in culture today the pressure of if you do not accept what we accept, there's going to be some consequences to that? We're seeing that. Yeah, what was it, somebody? Yes. Well, we just see that. We if you don't accept what we tell you that you must accept, and I'm talking moral issues, right? Then you're on the wrong side of history, and there's consequences to that. And it's been that way a long time with abortion. It's now that way with LGBTQ and whatever letters they're now adding to that. It's that way now that if you don't endorse those things, it's not just simply that you're opposed to it. Now you must actively endorse it, and if you don't, there's legal consequences sometimes to that, and we've seen that, right? What was his? Jack Phelps, I think his name was, the guy in Colorado that had the bake shop, and he's been in litigation for 12 years over this because he simply didn't want to endorse a homosexual marriage. And so that we see consequences to that in today's culture. It's the same principle of when you hear the music, you bow down. If not, there's consequences to that. Any other examples that you can think of? Yeah. Yeah, we saw that over the weekend. That was the big news, And so that culturally, we're being told you have to accept things like that. If not, there could be consequences to that. I think we'll see more of it as we go through. But I think we can see parallels to what in today's culture with some of the things that Daniel and his companions faced back then, especially Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right. So let's move to question number 2. Question number 2. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 3. So this is going to get us through the next section, verses 8 through 18. And the question is, were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were they right to refuse the king's order? And why or why not? And then the question is, how do we square that? How do we square refusal to do what a civil authority tells us to do with the obligation presented in Scripture, which is we must submit to civil authorities without examples? Let me read that. Let's read that section, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. How we square refusing a king's order and the Bible telling us that we must obey those that have the rule over us. Let's start in verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. It's amazing, isn't it? The enemies of God's people are always very nearby to tell on God's people when they don't do the right thing. So they spoke to the king Nebuchadnezzar, and they said, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I've set up? Now, if you are ready at the time, you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I've made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. What are your thoughts on this section? What do you think about that? Yeah, Philip?
One of the things I look at, that they were in public service, you might say.
They were.
And I'm sure there's other Jews there that refused to do it, but being they were they were public servant, it would show that, everybody knew them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were high-profile people. They were part of those magistrates that got invited to be the celebrities. I mean, they were very well-known people in that occasion. Any thoughts on this, Joel?
I think of Peter and John's response in Acts 4.
Yeah.
They were told, you don't preach this anymore. It's who we listen to? We listen to you?
Yes, that's right.
We listen to God.
Yeah, that's right. Any thoughts, Gene?
I believe, I'm not sure, but I think the Chaldeans were big on the letters of the law.
Mm-hmm.
That you couldn't have any exceptions.
No exceptions.
That it was totally black and white, and if you violated it, they would be first in line to say, punish.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about in that day, even with the Babylonians, and certainly the Medo-Persians considered themselves this way, because you'll read later, it says the law of the Medes and Persians does not change, right? It doesn't. You'll see that in Daniel chapter 6. But even the Babylonians, because if Nebuchadnezzar considered himself, and if they perceived him to be some sort of a divine figure, if he made a decree, well, that was a divine decree, and if you violated that, then you were spitting in the face of the gods to do that. And so Gina's right. They consider that a very serious offense. I always think it's interesting when you read this passage that you have Daniel and you have Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. You've got these folks, and it happened with Jesus too. You've got these people who are just kind of standing around taking joy in just tattletelling on them for violating the word of God. In Daniel 6, they set him up. I mean, they've set him up to be able to be in violation of the word of God, or the king's command, because they're so hoping that they can catch him in something. But obviously, certain of these influential men told on Daniel's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These people were clearly jealous of these very godly young men, and they, again, perceived it to be some great violation of the law. But it's interesting how they frame it. Did you catch this in verse 12? When it says, these men, these Jews that you took into slavery, these Jews that you put over provinces, they have not paid you due regard. What's the implication in that?
You shouldn't have put them there. We're better off.
We're better off. And how are they framing Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? How are they framing these men? they're not even grateful. Look at what you've done for them. They're not even grateful. They've not even given you due regard. I mean, they paint them in the worst possible light in this passage. And of course, once he's told, the king just can't believe that anybody would defy anything that he says, that anybody would go against his royal decree, especially 3 slave boys that he took under his wing and on whom he had bestowed great privileges. Now, he gave them great honor. Remember, hold your place and go back to chapter 1. Do you remember at the end of chapter 1 what he did for them? Go back to chapter 1, look at verse 19. This is after the dietary test. Remember, they said, we'll eat the vegetables and the water, and you have the king's meat and the wine, and we'll see who comes out better. Verse 19, the king interviewed them, and among all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Did he think that they were pretty special young men?
Yeah.
And now here are these special young men that he had interviewed and set even higher in positions of authority, and they're defying him. And, of course, it probably didn't help that these men were like, they're not honoring you. They're not even giving you due regard, and they kind of frame his response to that. But he's very angry, and so he gives them one more chance, but only one more chance, because he tells them in verse 15, you've got to do this, and if you do it, then that's fine. But it's interesting how he ends verse 15, right? When he says, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? What's that tell you about his attitude? What's he thinking?
He thinks he is God.
Arrogance? What was that, Gloria?
I said he thinks he is God.
He thinks he is a God. There's nobody that you're going to claim as God that's going to be greater in authority than I am. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Art, you had your hand up.
We see a lot of times leaders in area, even in our businesses and
Yes.
in our political area, and these people have huge egos.
They do.
And I've run across it in my life all the time. They're huge egos, and you just attack their ego, and they're in a fury over it.
Yeah.
And
Invincible almost, they seem. Philip?
He looked at it, he's gonna lose all kind of people if he, tries to go back on it. So he's got to please the people. He'll lose his authority, because he gave us, the law, and he had to fulfill it, or he'd be out of control.
Yeah, and it goes back to this public image thing, all right? So he's invited all these celebrities in, and now, everybody's watching the celebrities, and now you have 3 of them that don't bow down. You can't have that if you're trying to get uniformity among all the people. And so this is a crisis for him about saving face in front of the people. And so they respond in verse 16, and they say, we have no need to answer you in this matter. It's not an insulting reply. They're not dishonoring the king by doing this. They're simply saying that this is a situation that is out of their hands. This is beyond their control. They can't manipulate this situation. David?
That may be what we was talking about Wednesday night, David, maybe part of the first pulse.
Yeah.
That's what it kind of sounds like.
Yeah, it's a manipulating and things of that sort. Yeah, they do that. There's a lot of pressure psychology that's in on that. And their response, you have to love their response, because in their response, what are they admitting could be one of the possibilities?
That they won't make it.
If God doesn't want to save us out of the burning fire furnace, he may not do it. But I know that in the end, we are not going to worship idols. What they're telling the king is they're not in control of what the consequence of their action is going to be. But they are in control of their choice, and their choice is going to be to serve the Lord.
And you remember, he's giving them a second chance. Okay,
Yes.
we're gonna do it again. Now, if you'll bow down, everything's gonna be fine.
Right?
And they tell them, there's no need to.
Right.
We're
That's
not
it.
gonna-
Yeah.
The answer is no.
It's their way of saying there's no need for a lengthy discussion on this, because the choice has been made. We're going to serve the Lord, and whatever comes, comes. If the Lord saves us out of a burning fire furnace, great. If he doesn't, then that's on him. The Lord has grander purposes if he chooses not to do that. But we're not going to do that. Regardless of the consequence, we are going to honor the will of God. And you have to appreciate the courage in that situation. There's a lot of fear, obviously, that there would be. You probably can hear the sound of the crackling of the kiln nearby. You know what a potential consequence could be as a result of that. So how do we balance that now? How do we balance that? Because we have, Joel brought out Peter and John. I think we should take a look at that. And then we've got Romans 13, and we've got 2 passages that are telling us if we don't put them in balance, it would almost seem contradictory. So let's do this. Let's do Romans 13 first, and then let's go and look at Acts chapter 5, the passage Joel was talking about. So let's do Romans 13. So here's what God tells us about civil authorities. So let's go to Romans 13. Let's take a look at civil obligation, our obligation to civil authorities. Verse 1. Let every soul, does that include us in this room?
Yes.
Okay. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Now, does that mean that God specifically hand selects every single leader, every county mayor, every assessor of property, every this and that, all the way up to the president or a monarchy or whatever? Does he hand select that, or what is this verse telling us?
God has set up a system.
That's it.
And we see it from day one. There's always been a system of authority.
Yes.
And someone, is to answer to.
So he sets up the right for authorities to exist. Did he set up a particular brand of authority? So did he set up a democracy? Is democracy God's way versus a monarchy? There is no preferred way. Whatever authorities exist in any civil society, God authorizes there to be authority. Okay? And those who live under that, in the context of that, we live in this democracy that we live in. The republic is how it started, but we live in this democracy that we live in. We are subject to the civil authorities of local, Hamilton County. If you live in the city of Chattanooga, city of Saudi Daisy, Lakeside, wherever you live, we're subject to those authorities. And even greater authorities than that, in America, you've got, state level, and then you've got federal level. So we're amenable to those. And when he says every soul has to be subject to those authorities, that means we're subject to all of those authorities. We are subject to those. And then he goes on and talks about the reason that exists. So let's set that against Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. So Peter and John have been preaching since Pentecost. They've been preaching and healing, and they've been called on the carpet a couple of times for what they are preaching and teaching. And let's go to Acts chapter 5. The apostles get in trouble again. And when the council again tells them, don't you dare say anything about Jesus Christ, don't you preach the gospel, look at verse 29. Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So how do we balance? Okay, so this is a New Testament principle that is illustrated in the actions of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Because they're telling the king, you may be the king, but we're going to honor God. So how do we balance that? How do we balance let every soul subject to higher authorities, and yet we obey God rather than men? How do we balance that out? Yeah, Don and then Gene. Yeah. Caesar's things are Caesar's. Things that are God's, things are God. Gene? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. So let's do some examples. Because I think we could see that if we take and move this back into, even if we were to use, we've already had the example of this, right? In Daniel, when those boys were told to learn Babylonian culture, did they do that? Right. But when he says bow down to idols, they couldn't do that, right? So let's move it into today's context. If our government says you owe taxes, what is our response to that?
Pay 'em.
Besides going, because it's just, we hate that. You have to do it, right? Because render to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's. If our government says the speed limit on this road is 70 miles an hour, what's the limit? It's 70, right? It's not, it's not 120 because I just feel that way. We are subject to those governing, because does a speed law cause me to violate the will of God? No. Does taxation cause me to give up on my faith in Jesus Christ? No. What if they come back and the laws of the land say, we're telling you, you can't assemble on Sunday anymore? What do we do with that?
We find a way to do it anyway.
Yeah, we find a way to do it anyway because we're going to obey God rather than men. Or if they come back out and they say, we've determined that we're going to outlaw singing. You cannot congregationally sing anymore. I'm not going to abide by that. There may be a burning fiery furnace, but we're going to do what God tells us to do. Or if the Lord's Supper somehow gets banned, or they say that you have to deny the deity of Jesus, which they did, by the way, in the first century and beyond in the persecution of Rome. Or they try to ban the Bible, or they want us to endorse ungodly ideas. There's a difference when it causes us to come into direct conflict with the will of God. We have to choose the will of God. And that's what Daniel's friends were doing on this occasion. Somebody had their hand up back here. Yes, Steve?
The devil's sly, and he's allowing, like the government, to allow things to occur that we're not allowed to do, like
Yeah.
divorce and remarriage,
Right.
Abortion. The government allows those things, but yet
Just because something is legal in civil terms, does it make it right? No, it doesn't make it right just because civil authority attaches. So, the interesting to that, all civil authorities, where do they get their authority from? And there's an implication in that they're required by their very existence to honor the God who gave them that authority. It's just that many of them don't do that. Very few of them do that these days anymore. Okay, real quick before we run out of time. Question number three. I think we can get through this. Question number 3. The 3 young men they're thrown into the fire, but they are miraculously preserved. What do you make of the 4th person that is in the fire in verses 24 and 25? And also, what are the results of the challenge of their faith? What happens as a result of that? What's going on? What are your thoughts on this last section in Daniel chapter 3?
he refers to him as both an angel and the Son of God.
Right? All right, so we have Nebuchadnezzar actually saying something about it twice in the passage, one from the standpoint of observation and another from reflection. What about the fire? Is there any indication that it was really hot?
Well, killed some of the men.
Okay,
took them
so
up there.
it's really hot because Nebuchadnezzar orders them thrown in the fire. And look at verse 22. Because the king's command was urgent, he's wanting them in right now. There's no precautions obviously taken. The furnace was exceedingly hot. How do you make it hotter than hot? I don't know, but it was really, really hot. The flame of the fire killed the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they're rushing them to the fire, and obviously there was a burst of flame that's just sort of rolling out, and it just drops dead. The men that are just carrying them in there. And so but somehow in that forward motion they ended up in the fire, because in verse 23 the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. It says that it was burning 7 times hotter. Now he said that's what he said. If you have, I don't know how you make flame 7 times hotter. I don't know how you would do that, but it almost sounds like in his rage, he would do like we would do. He uses a figure of speech when we do that. We would say, 100 times more or something. We just throw a number out there. It was really hot, though, because it did kill those men. And in verses 22 and 23, they did fall into the fire. And in there, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, so you can imagine everybody's looking at this. They're standing by, they're looking. And Nebuchadnezzar actually has to ask somebody by him, and he says, I thought we cast only 3 people into the fire. Why is there a 4th guy walking around in there? And he says in verse 25, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. I don't think that translation is the best translation. Do you have a marginal note that gives a better translation? Yeah.
The New King James says, Son of God's.
Yes, Son of God's. A literal translation probably is that. It says, a son of the gods. From his perspective, what's he thinking? There's some sort of deity in there. This is not him saying in this passage, there is Jesus Christ in the middle of that. He doesn't understand that. And from his pagan perspective, he has yet to understand much about Jehovah. He's simply identifying that whoever that 4th person is the person who's responsible for miraculously preserving them in the midst of that fire. Who is it? Later in the passage, down in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered him. So he thought in some way it was some sort of angelic form. We don't know. Here's your two options. It was either an angel of God that God sent to be with them, and there are angels active in the book of Daniel, or it was God in some sort of human form, and in the Bible he often did that. Like in Genesis 18, he appeared to Abraham in the form of a human. Do you remember when Stephen was being killed? Stephen looked up, and what did he see? He saw, Jesus standing at the right hand of the throne of God. It could have been a situation like this. These boys are in a dire situation, and the Lord shows up in that situation. We don't really absolutely know for sure. Hey, we're out of time. I don't want to rush the end of this. Let's put a peg in it here. We've got just a few more comments. I want to focus next week on they come out and what signs are perceived by the people that a miracle has taken place, and what happens as a result of that. What happens to these boys afterward, and what is Nebuchadnezzar's response? But go ahead and study chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream, and there's a consequence to that. He's punished, and take a look at how he's punished, and we'll talk about his response to that punishment and what that may or may not mean at the end of chapter 4. Good discussion today. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.